So Swifters, this isn't really a tutorial, though it can be viewed like one. I'm posting this, it's a previous exam problem so that my current students can test their own knowledge prior to their final exam. They actually received the earlier printed exam, so they tried this on their own. This is posted so that they can review their own results, maybe brush up on some concepts if they struggled a bit. They were tasked with creating the Legends of Swift app. This uses the Chuck Norris API, they've never seen this before, to offer an over-the-top programming complement to a programmer and to offer the option to insert the correct gender pronouns as well as the first and last name. So I put this together pretty quickly. It has a bit less polish than our typical tutorial videos. There was some construction work happening outside of my home office, so I'm sorry if there's some weird humming noises in the background, but hopefully you'll find this useful and perhaps even a bit of fun. So let's code. Alright, Swifters, I'm posting an old text as an exam review for my current students. The end result we'll come up with will be a little bit different than what we asked for in this exam, so some of the questions may vary because I now have my students use URL session instead of the Alamo Fire CocoaPod and native Swift JSON parsing instead of the Swifty JSON CocoaPod, so we'll ignore anything that mentions CocoaPods and those latter two products. However, we are going to leverage the Chuck Norris API that celebrates the world's best-known cowboy ninja and a well-known meme that attributes impossible tasks to said cowboy ninja. There is a dev subset that has hyperbolic quotes related to software development. We will use that subset. We will create an app that looks like this, and we'll use it to celebrate the Swiftacular skills of our favorite programmers, which include you. What's more, since many of the world's greatest programmers have been women, and arguably the first programmer, Ada Lovelace, was a woman, we need to make sure that we can swap pronouns in our over-the-top complimentary quotes. We'll limit pronouns to male and female, but if you'd like to offer more gender diversity, feel free to expand your app after the exam. For now, let's giddy up. So this is the URL of the API that we're going to use. I'm just going to copy it and then head over to the web and paste it in so we can take a look at the results. We see there's a categories array here, but we're going to ignore that. Really, the only value that we care about is the one that's named value. We can see it's at the root level here in the API. It's not nested inside of other results. It's not inside of an array. So we're going to make sure that whatever we get is going to use the key value at the root level. That should give us the quote that we want. So the next part of the exam has us build out the user interface. This is what it should look like. You can pause here to try to give the question a shot on your own, or we can build it together. So first things up, let's create a new Xcode project. We'll launch Xcode. It's going to be a single view app. The product name will be Legends of Swift. Make sure that we're working on the storyboard here. Click Next. I'm going to create mine right on the desktop. Expand my screen. Head over to the main storyboard. Click on the library, and I'm going to drag over a single label. Then I'll Command D to duplicate that label. I'll do it one more time. Now this first label up top here, I want that to say Legends of Swift. I'll center that. I'll set up a custom font to the font family Avenir Next Condensed, one of my favorites. I'll make it bold style, 36 points. Let me just move my interface around here, stretch out my Legends of Swift label, and I'll set this color to this nice deep blue. Whoops, once again my terrible spelling strikes. Gotta fix Legends. There we go. Now this next label will have the static text, first name, colon. I'll set the font up to a custom font, Avenir Next Condensed again. Let's make that medium. We'll keep it at 17 points. And we'll also set the text color to that nice deep blue. Then let's add a text field below this, so click Library, search for text field. I'll drag it onto my view controller, stretch it end to end. Then I'm going to draw a little selection rectangle around my first name and my text field. I'll do a Command D to duplicate. Drag these duplicates down below the first name. This is going to hold my last name, so I'll click on the second occurrence of first name here and just change that static text so that it says last name. Now this last label is going to hold my quote, so I'll just drag it down a little bit below and make this a larger label, dragging it so that the left and right sides of the label box touch the margins. I'll put in some static text that says quote will go here. Then above that, let's add a segmented control, so we'll click on Library, search for segmented control. I'll drag that onto my view controller, put it right on that left to right center line. I'll set the segment 0 so that it says male, and then I'll pull down the segment to segment 1, and I'll set that segment title to female. I also need a button. Click Library, search for button, drag it over. I'll also put that on that left to right center line, and I'll change the title to Get a Quote. And I'll stretch this button out a little bit more so I get more of a click surface area. Make sure that it's centered. I'll drag my quote up here, and you know what? I'm just going to position it in the upper left-hand corner. I'll do a command equal sign, which will shrink down my label to just the size of the quote that I have inside, but I'll stretch it out to the right margin now. And I'm going to use the hybrid technique, which embeds everything that I have here in a view, but I'm also going to show you one problem that we have in trying to resize a label with 0 lines so it'll extend down below. That actually doesn't work with our auto resizing, so we're going to have to set another constraint on this. But first, I'll show you the problem, and to do that, I'm going to set lines to 0 here, and you'll notice in our first run, we'll have a bit of a problem with the resizing of this label, and we'll fix it later. And I'm just going to set the font for my message label down here to System Italic. Now to use the hybrid technique, I'm going to select everything that's inside of this view controller. So I'll draw a selection rectangle so that everything is selected inside of that rectangle. If you look over at the document outline, you can see all of my objects are selected. Then I'll go down here in the lower right-hand corner and I'll click on the embed icon and select to embed in view. Now notice it draws a view. It's not exactly the dimension that I want, so I'm going to click on Add New Constraints. Now just a tip, for this top one, if I pull down here, I see that it is selecting the safe area. Sometimes I've noticed that the safe area option doesn't show up, and if it doesn't, you can just click on the view, drag it down a little bit, and then the next time you click on Add New Constraints, it should show the safe area. So I think that happens sometimes if your view is created and it overlaps a little bit and extends outside of the safe area. But we've got our safe area showing, so I'm just going to set my constraints to 0, 0, 0, and 0 for all 4. Again, we've got our safe area constraints to the top and the bottom, add 4 constraints. Now let's set up auto resizing. So I'm going to click on my Legends of Swift label, then click the size inspector. I want this to be constrained to the top, left, and right, so those outside lines should be clicked in red. And I also want it to stretch left and right, so I'm going to click on the horizontal line so that that's in red as well. The first name and last name static labels don't need any change at all, so I'll leave those alone. If I click on my 2 text fields though, I want to change them so that they have the same kind of auto resizing that I set up for Legends of Swift. So that's the top, left, and right outer lines in red, and the center horizontal line in red as well. And I'll select both my segmented control, option click on Get Quote, and I want that auto resizing to be only the top center line. And I'm going to set up my quote will go here with the kinds of constraints that I think will work, but we'll see that the line resizing doesn't work properly. So it's good to demonstrate this to you in case you use this technique and what problems will occur and how do you fix that. So with my quote will go here selected, I'm going to give it the same kind of auto resizing as I did for my Legends of Swift. So that's top, left, and right. Outers are in red and the inner horizontal is in red as well. And now let's set up our outlets and our action. So I'm going to option click on main storyboard. So I'm in assistant editor mode, give myself a little bit more room here. And I'm going to speed this up, and I actually had to rename. I initially named my fields as labels, so there's no reason for you to have to suffer through my typos, but my IB outlet should be first name field, last name field, output label, gender segmented control. Oops, and a jump cut in here. I also need to control drag over from my button to create an IB action named get fact pressed. Now I'll get out of assistant editor mode, and over here the test just says to make sure that you've got constraints set up. We use the hybrid technique, so again, if we go over to main storyboard and we take a look at devices of different sizes, it looks like everything is resizing properly, but again, we are going to run into a problem with our output label. I'll show you that in a bit though, and how to fix it so you can recognize that and deal with it if you encounter this in the future. But our next step is to create a new class named fact. That's an upper camel case because a class is a type. So we'll create a file called fact.swift. We need to make sure that we also create a fact object to return the quote in our viewcontroller.swift. And we should have a string named quote, and we're also going to have a URL, which is a string, which has this string here. So I'm just going to highlight that and copy it. Then I'll head back to Xcode. I want to put my new fact.swift file just below the scenedelegate.swift. So I'll click on scenedelegate.swift and select new file. This is a Swift file. Next, I'm going to give it the name fact upper camel case. Click on create. Then I'll declare the class with class fact open and close curly. Then I'll add my URL variable var URL equals, and I'll paste the URL that I'd copied from the exam. And then above that, I also said we want to have a quote, which is a string, so I'll say var quote, and to avoid having to create any initializers, I'm just going to initialize the quote variable right away to an empty string. Now, next up in the exam, you're to create a method for fact, which is getQuote. Why don't we call ours getData, since that's the convention that we've been using in all of our previous apps. And we want to take the value that we're going to be getting, which is in the key value of the JSON that we return, and we want to put that into the quote property of our fact class. So again, tabbing over to our browser, we can see that JSON's going to return a key value pair where the key is value and it's paired with a string, which gives us one of our quotes. Each time we access this, it's going to give us a random quote. So the structure it's going to return is going to be pretty simple. We're just going to look for a value that's named value. So let's head back over to our fact.swift file and we'll create a codable struct. We'll say struct, why don't we call this capital result? Codable, open and close curlies, and we really only want one value here, so we'll say var value : string. And now for my students, you've been writing really reusable code for most of the semester, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up one of my older projects, the Game of Thrones project, and I'm going to grab my getData function from inside of there. So inside of my Game of Thrones project, what I just opened up, I'm going to go into houses.swift, I'm going to find the whole getData function, highlight it, copy it with a command C, then I can close up my Game of Thrones project and head back over to my Legends of Swift project, and I'm just going to paste this getData into my fact class. Now, modifying this should be super easy, so in my getData method, I'm going to set my URL string up to the URL property that I've defined above. This is going to give me a random developer-oriented Chuck Norris quote, so I don't need to do any changes to that at all. And after I set up the URL, as always, the only changes that I need to make are inside of my do try catch clause. So down here where I decode my JSON, I don't want to decode it into an array of house info like I did with Game of Thrones. I'm going to decode it into a result type with capital R. I'll save that into a local constant called result. I can actually cut out everything down below that heads to the catch portion of this clause, and then I'll put in a print statement, which is just print, and it's quote, string interp, result.value. But you know what? This is just such simple JSON to return and parse. I'm also going to say self.quote equals result.value. That's going to take the value property in the local result constant that I just created, and it will put it into the fact property that's called quote. Then let's head over to our viewcontroller.swift, and since we're going to call and check the printed results here, I'm going to also update my output label when I get my results from calling getData. Now first in view.did_load, what I'll do is I'll set my output label to an empty string, so just output label.text equals open and close double quotes. That's just to clear out the text that said something like quote will go here. We want that output label to be empty when you first start your app so that there's no quote showing. We need to make sure that we initialize an object of class type fact. If we didn't do that, we wouldn't be able to call getData on fact. So we'll say up top here, a class-wide property var lowercase fact equals uppercase fact with the open and close parens to create that fact. Then down here inside of our getFact pressed IB action, we'll say fact.getData. When we press enter, we get our trailing closure in here. Remember, we want to set up dispatch queue.main.async and open and close curlies so that we can put anything to update our interface on the main thread. And for that, let's see, what we want is self.fact.quote, and we're going to set that equal to, or we should say, we're going to take self.outputlabel.text equal to self.fact.quote. And now let's build and run and see what we got. Build succeeded. It's hammer time. The UI is looking good. Let's click get a quote. Hey, we see the results printed down below. We also see a quote here, but we get a ... at the end. Hey, our label is not extending down below even though we set it to lines equal 0. We can click that a few times and we see that continues to happen. Unfortunately, when you do auto resizing, the lines equal 0 technique doesn't work properly. So what we're going to do is we're going to set constraints on that label. Let's head back over to main storyboard. What we'll need to do is on this label only set constraints on it. So I'm going to click on the label, then go down here to add new constraints, and I'm going to change the top constraint. I don't want to constrain it to the button that's just above it, which is the automatic selection, the get a quote button. And the reason why I don't want to select the button is because the button is going to continue to use auto resizing. And as soon as I constrain something to another object which uses auto resizing, all the auto resizing goes away. So instead, we're going to constrain it to the view, which won't impact auto resizing at all because that view is already constrained to our safe area. Now notice Xcode is automatically going to give me the distance from the view proper as 351. You probably have a different number there, but I'm going to select view 351. The red line goes in, so that constraint is going to be fine. I'm going to keep it at 20-point margins on my left and right, but make sure that I click on those red lines as well, so I'm adding 3 constraints. No, I'm not going to set the height because the height is going to be set by the lines that can grow because lines are set to 0. So click Add 3 constraints, build and run. And as we click through here, we can see that our label is expanding to be able to give us as much room as we need for as many lines as we need to display. Nice. Let's head back to viewcontroller.swift and finish this up. And actually, since you're reviewing for the test, I want to show you that there are a bunch of different ways that we could have gotten the data back using Codable to parse the JSON results. Now, I had specifically asked in the previous exam for students to set up a property named quote, but on your exam, I actually might not necessarily constrain you to that because there's an even more efficient way to create this without having to create a result struct. So let's head back over here to fact.swift. Let's make this fact class codable so that we can use this to directly decode JSON. Now, if we're going to decode into this codable fact class, what we need to do is we need to make sure that it's got a value property. So instead of the quote property in here, I'm just going to paste in value instead of quote. Then I'm going to highlight my whole result struct in here because I don't need that anymore. I'll do a command / to comment that out. Then if we go down to our do, try, catch loop, and since our result class doesn't exist anymore, we've got to replace this with a class that does exist, which is the fact class. So we'll delete result and replace it with capital fact. Now, in terms of decoding this, we can't decode directly into the class we have our getData function in. If we try to say self in here or self.fact, none of those things are going to work. And I'm going to delete this additional assignment line and the print line down here. So just look at the error that we get when we build and run. It says cannot assign value to self because it's immutable. But one thing that we can do is we can create a local constant called, well, why don't we call it fact? So we'll say let lowercase fact equals. That will hold our JSON decoded value, which is now in an object of type fact. Now again, down here we can't say self equals fact because the self is immutable, but what we can do is we can easily take anything that's inside of fact and assign that into any of the properties of self. So we can say self.value equals fact.value. Before we can build and run now, we've got to head over to viewcontroller.swift because we no longer have a quote property, so we have to say self.fact.value equals the self output label.text. Now let's build and run, and we'll get a quote. And again, we see we get the same result, so it's just what we expected. It just avoided us having to create that extra structure inside of our fact.swift class. We didn't have to do this. Either technique would work fine. And there are a bunch of other techniques that we could have used that we haven't learned yet, like coding keys. You can find out some information about that online if you want to explore it. I actually think having a property named quote in our fact class is better than having something named value. I'm going to uncomment out my result struct here. I'm just going to go ahead and reset this property to quote. I actually should have declared this as a private struct so that it's not accessible outside of this class because I'm only using it internally. It still works fine if it's not private. It just means that this structure is exposed to any instance of the fact class. Doesn't need to be. It'll just kind of pollute the namespace a little bit with more stuff that's presented in code completion than we need. Now I'll scroll down to my do, try, catch clause, and I'll change my fact.self to result.self, and I'll save this to a local constant called lowercase result. And I'll set self.quote, because now that property is called quote, to result.value. I also need to go into viewcontroller.swift, and inside of getData, I need to change self.fact.value to .quote. Build and run. Again, just a little detour to discuss different ways that we could decode our JSON. Hopefully that clarifies things for you. And as expected, everything's working fine, no big change. So let's head back into Xcode, and let's take a look at the exam, and we need to change any occurrence of Chuck, either capitalized or not, to the person's first name, as well as Norris, capitalized or not, to the person's last name. And this should be done via a function called replaceName that takes a string named quote and returns a string. So back to Xcode, func replaceName, and then in parentheses we'll pass in quote, colon, capital string, and then arrow, string is what we're returning, open and close curlies, and we'll return a value. Let's see up here, we'll say var new quote equals quote, because we're going to take this quote, which comes in as a constant, and we're going to modify it, and we'll return that new quote. And then down below, we'll just use replacing occurrences of. So we'll say new quote equals new quote dot replacing occurrences of. And we'll select this first option here, which takes a look at a string. So replace an occurrence of one string with another string. And we'll replace occurrences of Chuck with a capital C with first name field dot text exclamation point. Then I'll copy this, paste it down below. I'll change capital Chuck to lowercase Chuck. And that's in there just because I've noticed when going through a bunch of this data that there are some references to lowercase Chuck. Then I'll copy this first, replacing occurrences of again, paste it down below, change capital Chuck to capital Norris, and that should be replaced with the last name field, text exclamation point. Copy that line, paste it down below, change capital Norris to lowercase Norris. Everything else is the same. And let's call in dispatchq.async just before we update the output label. We'll call self.replace name, and for quote we'll pass in self.fact.quote, and actually we'll set this equal to self.fact.quote. So it's self.fact.quote equals self.replacement name, passing in self.fact.quote. Build and run, hammer time, no errors, and let's put in another one of my TA's Step Canusio, and we'll get a quote, and a diff between your code and Step Canusio's is infinite. Again, Step insists on strongly typed programming languages, just like Swift. We can click a couple more times. This is all looking good. Everything is updated. We're replacing Chuck Norris with first name and last name. Wonderful. So let's head back to Xcode. Actually, let's head back to our exam. And there's one other quirk which you might notice if you go through enough of this data. The quote marks show up as an ampersand QUOT. So we actually need to convert this into something that will show a double quote. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to continue to use replacing occurrences of. We're going to modify replace name, and we're going to look for that space and then ampersand QUOT and then a space afterward, and we're going to replace that with double quote space slash double quote space double quote. And yes, that's not a typo. There are 3 double quotes in there, but remember the escaped character with a slash double quote will put a double quote inside of a string. So I'm going to highlight this first string that I'm going to be searching for, which is space ampersand QOT space. Copy that with a Command C. So let's head back to our code and modify replace name. And let me paste that string in down below here just for a second. I'm going to highlight my last replacing occurrences of. I'm going to paste that down below. Then I'll cut out my ampersand QUOT. I'll backspace over Norris. Remember, I want to put a space in before, then paste in ampersand QUOT, put a space in at the end. And then what I want to replace this with is, if you want, you can go back over to the exam and just highlight this with a Command C and go back and paste this over your last name field.text. But this is just double quote space slash double quote space double quote, and I know that'll work fine. Now, the next bit down here for question number 12 is we want to create a function named updateGender, which is going to take our quote string and it's going to return a string where we change all of the male equivalent pronouns to female equivalent pronouns. And we've got a list of all of the possible male equivalent pronouns, and you want to look closely in here. There's actually spaces in front of most of these, and it mentions right here in the quiz that there's a leading space character in front of all of these. And the reason why there's a leading space character is to prevent, for example, the HE inside of the word the not to be changed to T and then SHE for she. So all of the occurrences that have he in front of them, for example, have a space in front of them too. So this is one of the things that's a little bit tricky if you're ever working with replacing occurrences of, is you want to think of, all of the other occurrences that might happen outside of the strings that you're trying to replace. But let's head back to our code. I'll get rid of some of the extra carriage returns that I have in replace name. We'll create our new function here, func update gender. In between the parentheses, we'll pass in quote, colon, and that's going to be a string, and then arrow, and we're going to be passing out a string, open and close curlies. Then just like above, we'll say var new quote equals quote, and we'll return our new quote, so that's what we're going to modify. Before we forget, let's go ahead and call that down inside of our get data. So we can say if gender segmented control dot and its selected segment index, which will give us the value for the selected index. 0 is the first segment because those are 0 indexed as well. 1 is the second one. So we want to say equals equals 1, open and close curlies. Then inside we want to say update gender. And we want to say actually self.fact.quote equals update gender. I'll copy that from the line below and paste it up top. Self.fact.quote equals update gender. And inside the quote parameter that we're passing in will also be self.fact.quote. And we're also going to need a self in front of gender segmented control, and we'll need a self in front of the update gender function. Then, just to make things easier, I'm going to highlight both of these columns over here on the exam, copy them with Command C. I'm going to paste them into update gender, which is going to give me a whole bunch of errors because this is not Swift, but I just want them here so that I can reference them. Then I'll make a space right under var new quote equals quote, and I'll go up into the function above, and I'm going to copy one of my replacing occurrences of lines with Command C. I'm going to paste it down below. And for this first one, what I'll do is I'll replace space, lowercase him, with space, lowercase her. And the rest of this is going to be the same, so I'll just speed it up. But the lines are identical, but I'll replace parens he with parens she, capital he with capital she, lowercase his with lowercase hers, capital his with capital hers, beard with hair. I'll delete this extra text that I was using, and it looks like I'm one short. There's supposed to be 7 of these. So let's take a look at the exam question. And it looks like what I'm missing here is lowercase he with lowercase she. All right, that looks good. Why don't we build and run and take a look at the results? And let's try this on another one of my former TAs. That's Jolene Lozano, female, and get a quote. And we have no female pronouns in that first one. None in the second one. None in the third one. None of the fourth one. None of the fifth one. And the sixth one, still no female pronouns. 7, and finally 8. But oh no, you can see in here that I have an error, so I didn't put a space in after she, so that's why she and calls merged together. So let's head back into our code. Yep, I can see where I have that error. Let me make sure that I put the proper space in there. Let's see, I should have been a little bit more thorough. It looks like I was also missing some spaces on this third line down here with parentheses she. But I think I'm okay now, so let's go ahead and build and run and see how things look. This time we'll put in another brilliant woman that I've had the pleasure of working with as one of my teaching assistants. That's Linda Chen. Female, let's get a quote for Linda. Linda Chen is currently suing MySpace for taking the name of what she calls everything around you. So we got the pronoun in there perfectly. Let's click some more. No pronoun in that one. No pronoun in that one. Yes, hair instead of beard. And okay, we got a she instead of a he in here, so everything is looking good. Swifter, I hope your review of the exam went well. If you needed to review anything and brush up on anything, hopefully this was really helpful for you too. I'm wishing you the best in your final exam. Keep at it. Hope you learned a ton.